Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Kerridge and Partners webinar series. My name is Renisa Peterson and I am a consultant with the firm. As part of our vision to transform the leadership landscape, we have been working on a series of leadership events and in embracing these current digital times, have launched these online. Thank you to everyone who has been attending our webinar series over the last few weeks. They have certainly picked up momentum and sparked conversations online, spanning topics on leadership in crisis, talent development, and CEO succession. We wanted to pivot slightly and evolve a new theme of webinars, reflecting on the current context. In light of COVID-19 and the crisis worldwide, we can see that New Zealand has led the world in terms of successfully managing the crisis. There is a real focus on Kiwi leadership on a global stage. We think there is no better time than now to showcase the best of New Zealand leadership through a series of conversations with Kiwis who are making a difference to the world and learn from them what it is about us that sets us apart as leaders. We wish to explore our Turanga Waiwai here in New Zealand, the places where we feel especially empowered and connected, our place in the world. We are delighted you are joining us today for our second webinar on this leadership theme, To Kōrero with Sacha McMeeking. From instigating United Nations proceedings to architecting a Maori social enterprise fund and leading commercial negotiations, Sacha is a roving contributor to Iwi and Maori aspirations and brings an entrepreneurial lens. She is the former General Manager, Strategy and Influence for Ngāi Tahu, founder of Maui Lab, connecting students with communities and opportunities to develop next generation solutions for Te Ao Māori, a partner with Tumaya, a collaboration of Ngāi Tahu women in developing and growing leadership capability for their people. And she is also the head of Aotahi, the School of Maori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Canterbury. Kia ora, Sacha. For context on who is with us online as part of this community, we have over 90 people joining us today, comprising a mix of CEOs, professional directors, including chairs, and a cohort of senior executives from a broad range of sectors. Haere mai. Some housekeeping matters to address. Firstly, you've all joined this webinar on mute, and please rest assured you are not on video, so you can sit back and relax. You will remain on mute by default, so no need to stress about background noise either. We will also be uploading a recording of this webinar to our website, so no need to worry about writing too many notes. Secondly, we encourage you to participate by asking questions throughout this session. On the bottom of your screen, there is a Zoom chat function, Q&A. Please type in your questions and we will address the most popular ones during our panel session, which I will expand on shortly. Please can we request that you send your questions using the Q&A function instead of the Zoom chat function. Thirdly, we wanted to share the structure of our webinar today, so you know what to expect. Following this introduction, we will launch straight into a Q&A kōrero with Sacha and Nick Edlin. Nick is a partner with the Executive Search Practice, working across a diverse range of sectors, including government and Iwi organizations. Prior to joining Kerridge and Partners, he spent 8 years practicing law across New Zealand and the UK, and he was also a freelance sports journalist and writer for the New Zealand Herald. So without further ado, let's launch right in. Kia ora, Nick and Sacha.
Kia ora. Haere mai e hoama. Ko tauhino korokio te maunga, ko o Pāwahau, te awa, ko mermaid, te waka, ko Edlin, ko Dougal ngā hapu, ko Nick aho. Kia ora, Sacha.
Kia ora.
As Renisa mentioned, you describe yourself as a roving contributor to Iwi and Māori aspirations, and you have many different roles. Was this a natural evolution, or did you always intend to have a broad focus in your career?
Tuatahi e rere ana ngā mihi mata kui ki o koutou. Kua hara mai nei ki tēnei screen, Mauri ora. It's a real pleasure to be here and thank you for the invitation, Nick and Kerridge. I would really love to say I had a beautifully architected plan at the beginning, but the truth is I was and possibly still remain remarkably naive about what the realms of the possible are and were. So I started absolutely with the cause, but I didn't know how I could best give effect to that cause. And at each point in my career, as I've matured, I've seen something else that's possible and chased that with the same why, but continually evolving hows. And as the intro suggested, perhaps with commitment issues, because I struggled to just do one thing at a time.
Right. Were there any key early experiences that have shaped your career?
Yes, the first one was when I came out of law school and went and worked for the Iwi, which was a really precious opportunity. That I got that job because one of my Bolshi mates who had more confidence than I did went and talked to the CEO and chair and said, "You should give this girl a job, she's quite smart." Whereas I would have been far too shy to have done that. So thankfully they gave me a job. And that was when the foreshore and seabed issue first arose. So for me, the shaping was that I got to be an upstart and say, let's go to the UN. This is something that contravenes international law. I was 25 and the iwi and then later a number of iwi around the country said, okay. So from age of 25, I had a really precious opportunity to get backed in doing something that I believed. But equally, that was the first existential crisis point because we won at every UN body that we went to, at least on paper, but the reality didn't change. When we came back from the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which found in clear terms that the legislation breached international human rights standards, it was entirely dismissed by the government of the day. So that was my first moment of thinking, I believe in this cause, but apparently how I think we can best further it isn't actually viable, which was quite disappointing. So it was the combination, that experience of feeling like I could contribute, but equally feeling like the pathways that I knew about weren't the most effective to contribute to a changing world.
And through that period, were there any individuals who had a lasting impact on your leadership style or how your leadership evolved?
So many. When I had a little bit longer in the tooth, I had the opportunity to work in support of the Iwi chairs. And so it's been a lot of time following 60 plus year old men do the most remarkable things in the most remarkable way. So I think of people like Ta'achi Tairoa or Uncle Api, and seeing the way they did diplomacy, the way they were driven, the way they were whole and irreverent as humans and how they went about doing their things. I would never be able to emulate those great taniwha, but they were definitely the most instructive in what I believe leadership to be. As well as I went to work for one of Ngāi Tahu's settlement negotiators when I took on the general manager role. And I went there because I wanted to learn from his brain. That's Anaki Kuro. And he's a genius. He's in no uncertain terms. So I thought I was going in there to learn about how to think and how to have brilliant ideas. What I didn't realise from being with Anaki and around the Iwi chairs, it was really about how to be a different and more confident human and be stronger in the things that I value.
The coronavirus has been everybody's focus for the past few months now, and you're about to publish a co-authored article that addresses Māori responses to COVID-19. Can you describe the context for the research and the premise for the article?
So first, the mihi to Dr. Catherine Savage, who's the co-author on that paper. It's been wonderful to work with her. So Policy Quarterly, which is a journal that primarily services Wellington with thought pieces on policy responses, is publishing a special issue on COVID in August. And we had the opportunity to write an article specifically on the Māori responses to COVID, which I think is an undertold story currently. And the reason it's undertold is that just before lockdown, there was lots of modelling done about the likely infection rates that Māori would experience. And most of that modelling said that Māori would have infection and mortality rates at least twice the rate of non-Māori. And if anything, that was probably conservative forecasting, because if we go back 100 years to the 1918 pandemic, Māori had an infection rate 7 to 8 times that of non-Māori. And with our existing and lamented health inequities that Māori experience, we would have expected that pattern to continue. But the truth is that Māori have a disproportionately low infection rate. So in my opinion, the context for this story is it's the first time in New Zealand's contemporary history where Māori have better social outcomes than non-Māori. And given how many embedded challenging issues that we have, I think there's just immense value in looking at the one powerful example of how we got better social outcomes for Māori and learning from that and how we adapt it into our policy responses going forward.
So I guess that outcome was multifaceted, as you've suggested in the article, and you identify 4 broad categories that Māori responses to the crisis fell within: cultural adaptation, social cohesion and information networks, distributive networks, and community protection. I think I'd like to address each one in turn. If we start with cultural adaptation, what do you mean by that in the context of the crisis?
Well, there will be some on this webinar that had their Facebook feeds filled with the Ngāti Kahungunu meme about raising your eyebrows instead of doing the hongi. So before we went into lockdown, there was lots of very careful and very intentional work going on inside the Māori community about the way we do things that needed to change in response to the threat of a global pandemic. And that Ngāti Kahungunu meme, I think, is really instructive, because when the iwi was putting forward that meme, it wasn't just the raise your eyebrows, it's better for you story. It was looking back to their eponymous ancestor who is reputed to have raised his eyebrows in greeting a lot. And some would say that every time he raised his eyebrows, there was another baby born, because he was quite a fabulous lover, apparently. So in doing that kind of cultural adaptation, really important to contrast that with what became politicised tangihanga protocols. So many will have seen that there was contestation about the rules that applied to hukakotatangi when we were at various levels of the COVID response. I think it's important to see that the cultural adaptation initiatives that came out of Māori communities were really effective, whereas pressure to adapt culture that came from outside the community was really strongly resisted. And sitting underneath that, I think, is perhaps a misperception about how active Māori are in cultural change. I think for lots of New Zealand, we'll look at the examples of pohuri and the gender distinctions that exist within pohuri, and have the impression that Māori culture is quite resistant to change. But actually, if we look at these examples, we can see Māori doing intentional, strategic and culturally embedded processes of cultural change that are really effective. And if we see that, if we see Māori as being responsible and capable of that, it changes the degree of intervention and pressure that might be seen as sound in policy responses.
The second broad response was around social cohesion and information networks. Again, if you could just explain the context of that in terms of the crisis.
Well, so one of the things that we know just in normal life is that Māori experience access barriers to a range of services, whether it's accessing different health services or going into educational pathways. There are access barriers that are multiple, whether it's about practical barriers, can't get there because there's not a bus that runs on that route, or information barriers, can't do something that you don't know about, or perception barriers of, I don't want to do that because I think it will be a really uncomfortable and unpleasant experience for me. And sitting underneath all of those access barriers is the reality that lots of mainstream information networks don't reach into Māori communities. And what the Māori response to COVID involved was a whole range of really powerful information networks that reached into communities that wouldn't have otherwise been touched by mainstream messaging. We also saw through those same information networks that they tended to be bilateral, and that it wasn't just pushing information out about what the levels of the response meant or how to access different government supports. They were also networks that took traffic back the other way. So lots of Māori organisations that were finding kaumātua to see what kaumātua needed, as well as conveying information about what was available. Lots of surveys out in the field. So those networks are a really important complement, I think, to existing mainstream approaches to conveying information. And there was also, surrounding those networks, a whole lot of work that was focused on social cohesion. So there were lots of karakia that people could join in to digitally. There were people doing, there were songs released. There was a whole lot that was focused on not only informing people, but uplifting people, which I think there's value in seeing those two things as connected.
You also made the point within the context of that response that it was yet another example of innovation we see within Māori communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And that one's particularly important because face-to-face engagement within Māoridom is one of the fundamentals, and obviously one of the things not viable during the COVID response. So there was a huge amount of agile innovation, I think, is the really important thing. So the nightly karakia, or people doing webinars, sharing stories from people in the community, they were really fast responses.
Mm. The third response you've described is around distributive networks, around particularly around practical resources and kai. I'm really interested in the point you make within this response around.
Sorry, you tuned into a robot, so I'm just going to guess that question about how did the distributive networks operate. So I think the most important thing, most important thing is that those distributive networks showed that Māori have resources to add to national responses that are not otherwise available to New Zealand. So Iwi, urban Māori organisations, various holder organisations all contributed tangible material resources, as well as a network of people to do the distribution that wouldn't have otherwise been available to New Zealand. In that, changing the perspective from Māori as a drain on public resources to the Māori community being rich with resources that are otherwise not available, I think is a really important thing to recognise, as well as the relational dimensions to that. So the Māori community, and we know this from inside, we are fantastic at mobilising because we do it all the time. When there's a tangi, we mobilise, we get food from all over the place to feed people, we end up driving cars of people that we don't know, because we're on this collective effort to do the right kind of manaaki that's needed. So we have a relational ability to mobilise at speed. We've also got, with that, an ability to tap relationships that are warm and have got depth with them to leverage other resources. So you can look at the different iwi responses and see that they all tapped into an existing relationship to get more resources. So Ngāpuhi, who had relationships with the local supermarket in the South Island, Te Pūtahitanga, which is the Final Water Commissioning Agency, worked with a number of the initiatives that they've funded over time to help them pivot the resources they had available. So I think there's a lot more. So if we thought about relationships as neural pathways, those neurons are practiced all the time, so they're a lot faster and they can do more innovative things.
Sacha, hopefully you can see and hear me now. Within the context of that response, you also made a really interesting point around Iwi and Māori organisations bringing financial resources to the table. And perhaps that's in the course of history, a relatively new thing in the post-settlement era. Could you just expand on that? Because I think it's a particularly interesting new dimension to partnership dynamics.
And it's a back to the future type reality as well. So when the whalers and settlers, for example, were here around, at least I know about, for the Otago Peninsula, and no doubt all around the country, the reason that those early whalers were alive because local hapu fed them. And we've got a whole historical component of our history where the generosity of Māori communities is what enabled the settlement of New Zealand. And then we jump forward to now. So when we look at iwi and Māori organisations being able to contribute resources, it's not actually new for us. It's just we had a period when that was artificially stifled. But now, because we are in the post-settlement phase, because the Māori economy is $50 billion big and growing despite having a hit from COVID, we do need to adjust to a context where Māori are resource rich in cash and financial resources terms. We've always been rich in lots of other ways, particularly human. In a human sense, we've been rich. But the change that the post-settlement phase is going to bring to, instead of the dominant discourse in our media being about Māori advocating for rights, I think increasingly what we'll be able to see, in COVID as a brilliant example, is of Māori demonstrating responsibilities to our community and to the wider community, so that we move into a phase of the Māori community both increasingly being able to deliver our own destiny on our own terms, but also to contribute to the public interest in the broadest sense.
Mm. And the fourth response you discuss is, I guess, one that got quite a bit of attention from the mainstream media around community protection.
Yeah, community protection, otherwise known as iwi checkpoints, and perhaps the most politicised part of the Māori response. And I'm really grateful that the police commissioner wrote a really considered opinion piece on that I'd encourage people to find through the power of Google, because there was that debate at the beginning about the legality of the iwi checkpoints, which the police commissioner clarified in his opinion piece that those checkpoints were lawful. But more importantly, he identified the community safety benefits of those checkpoints, and which I think is a really helpful acknowledgement. But there's still a deeper misunderstanding about why those checkpoints existed, and another back to the future moral of the story. So that's not the first time that Māori communities have done checkpoints to protect exposed members of our community from infection. In the 1918 pandemic, there were roadblocks set up in a number of the same places where we had checkpoints set up this time as well. And the reason for those checkpoints, there's a few layers to it. So the first is it's a values-driven thing of we've got communities with kaumātua with a number of the risk factors identified for COVID. So we've got really high risks in lots of our communities. So there is a values-based response to wanting to look after people and to protect people. We've also got one of the consequences of our colonial history is an expectation within Māori communities that quite often the government either cannot or will not protect the distinctive interests of Māori communities. So you've got people who love the people in their community. They're driven by love to look after those members of their community. And they've got an expectation that if they don't do something, no one else will. And those people that they love will be exposed to high risk. And I think that that story about seeing the checkpoints as an emanation of love with a backdrop of we have to do it ourselves because no one else will, love and necessity, created a response that's been widely misunderstood, I think.
Yeah, on that, you used a really interesting word as a way of viewing that particular response was when humanised.
Yes, and I think lots of our Māori issues are politicised rather than humanised. We don't look at what the emotional drivers for a number of strategies are. And I think it's really important if we're going to build an empathy-based understanding, which in a global context shaped by the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, I think it underscores the importance of empathy-based understanding.
The research concludes with a fascinating insight, and it's that of orientation, or how the Māori community is framed. And I guess that's an extension of what you've just discussed now. What can we learn from this from two fronts, both from a public policy perspective and from a broader society perspective?
That's a great question. And I think from a public policy perspective, the most important insight is that this is what strengths-based policy looks like. So we've had at least 10 years of strengths-based being part of our policy discourse, with I think there being pretty variable understanding about what strengths-based means. And the COVID response, the multifaceted nature of the Māori response, the agility, the innovation, the reach, being able to see those capabilities within the Māori community and back them to do the things that they can uniquely do that no one else can do, that's what strengths-based policy means in practice. And I don't think we've had enough recognition of the very many tangible examples of what strengths-based policy really looks like. And that speaks to the broader relevance of the Māori response, because you could absolutely tell the story about Māori vulnerabilities to COVID. That is a very true story. And those vulnerabilities are as diverse as the response. So the health vulnerabilities to being affected with COVID, the financial security vulnerabilities, and that there will be a disproportionate number of Māori that become unemployed because of COVID, with an asterisk that a disproportionate number of them are likely to be Māori women because of the sectors that they're concentrated in. As a consequence of that financial security, there will be many experiences of pain and hurt inside families. We know the connections between financial insecurity and spikes in domestic violence rates. We know the correlation between financial insecurity and suicide. So lots of those statistical vulnerabilities that we know so well in New Zealand are very true as a result of COVID. Māori will be disproportionately exposed to being poorer, more brutalised, and all of those gritty dimensions. That's a true story. But the other story is the Māori have resource-rich relational strength, innovative patterns within our community. And I think it's really important that we start to pair the vulnerability story with the capability story, because the things that the Māori community did during COVID, they're not unique to COVID. We're doing exactly the same things inside our communities every day. And we have to, I think as a nation, start seeing that capability within our communities so that we can then back that capability to do things that no one else will.
I know that another interest of yours is the theory and practice around building communities of impact. Can you define for us what a community of impact is?
So I think community of impact is the nirvana of the collaboration movement. How do you move from the nice fluffy statements of aspiration about let's collaborate and collaboration is the new black and we need everyone in the waka. How do you go from the rhetoric to the reality of being able to deliver collectively? And I think one of the challenges that we all know in our life is that the rhetoric part of collaboration is really satisfying and it is really attractive. So people join for the talking about collaboration and the aspiring to the meaning and the potential of collaboration, and then pulling it off is where it all falls apart. It is really hard to get collaboration to work in practice, as we all know, and it tends to go with that cycle of we talk about collaboration and we have a great lift in enthusiasm, and then we have the great fall into the nobody wants to play with me anymore because it's hard. So the communities of impact work is about looking at the different mechanisms that enable us to go from talking to doing together. And I think there's really interesting values-based dimensions to those conversations. So if we look at individuals as kind of the center of a community of impact, then it leads to a particular way of building a community. You have lots of empowered individuals that voluntarily choose to collaborate, whereas if you look at it from a different value space, which isn't so focused on the individual, then you see a range of different types of interventions that are needed. So you could, loosely, you could contrast how a grassroots movement ferments itself, which is lots of empowered individuals come together to do something that they collectively believe in, versus how a social movement is formed, which has got a whole lot more infrastructure into how a social movement is develops its identity and sustains its momentum.
So do the consequences of the two different approaches necessitate different leadership styles?
Yes, I think they have different leadership styles, different value at different times, and a different level of fit with different types of communities. So there are, a grassroots movement, depending on whether it, how it's centred, is more likely to require a hands-off approach from some of the typical leaders, I think, to enable that stepping up. Whereas a social movement, I think, needs more active framing. It's more reliant on the charismatic leadership that we're really familiar with. But they both, to some extent, rely on distributed leadership. So a grassroots movement will only flourish if there's distributed leadership, at least from the things that I've read. Whereas a social movement can have more concentrated and ordered types of leadership that operate in it. And the community fit is going to come back to how much autonomy does the community itself expect to have in the evolution of the community.
Do you see that there's a natural link between what you're discussing here around communities of impact and I guess the findings of your research as articulated in the upcoming article that we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think that the most helpful connection is that the Māori response to COVID has both the grassroots dimension to it as well as a social movement dimension to it. So the way in which localised communities responded to the needs of their community was very much a grassroots movement response. But that grassroots response exists within what I think of as an intergenerational social movement. So if a social movement requires really active framing about purpose and vision and all of that kind of stuff, within the Māori community, we've had possibly getting up to 9 or 10 generations now who have framed a social movement about the regeneration of our communities and our own image. And there's various language for that. Some would call it the mana motuhake movement, an Indigenous self-determination movement. And I think that movement is very tangible inside the Māori community, but not so visible outside the Māori community. And I think it would be fair to say that for my career, I was enlisted into that social movement, and the purposes and objectives of regenerating the vitality and the capabilities within our community, that to me is what the regeneration of mana motuhake is all about. And pursuing that goal has guided every career decision I've made about how can I better contribute to that social movement. And I think on the more macro scale, what we saw with the grassroots responses inside the Māori community, we're also within the umbrella of that social movement. The reasons that different iwi, hapu, hauora, urban Māori groups did what they did was because there was a shared view about our place and our responsibilities to our community.
Kia ora, Sacha. I know we've had lots of questions come in from our audience, so I'll hand over to Renisa now, and she can ask some of those questions that have come through.
Ngā mihi nui, Sacha and Nick. We have indeed had a number of questions and comments come through, and you've both sparked food for thought. For myself as well, listening in, reflecting on conversations we've had with local iwi in Auckland, who innovated by having their first ever digital kapahaka lessons, placing orders for flat pack small houses that they could build on site in backyards so that whānau could safely socially distance themselves. And for me, the most impactful one was, I just want to go back to your point, Sacha, it shouldn't be understated, the extensive cultural change that iwi have had to do on their deepest core values on faith and funeral rites and adapting behaviours for a tangi. It is testament to the cultural adaptability and care with which Māori have responded to COVID-19. We've had a number of questions come through from the audience. The first one is, what would you say are the unique characteristics of Kiwi leaders that help us thrive globally? And if I may add a layer to this question, please, Sacha, I'm curious on your thoughts about Māori leadership and tikanga values such as kaitiakitanga, manaakitanga, and how they form unique characteristics that help Kiwi leaders thrive globally.
That's a great question that I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer it, but I'll have a crack. So I think it's about as a nation, we are really focused on the how we do things matters. I think one of the things that's distinctive about New Zealand, and particularly inside the Māori community, is that we tend to be quite consultative about how we do things. There is a desire for more consensus-based approaches, and this is where I think if we went into lots of our large corporates or our government departments, there's a consultative element which is more pronounced than lots of other countries. And I think that it is distinct inside Māori organisations, so I'm not talking about them at the moment, but I think that that consultative approach gives us a national character of how we do relationships and how we engage with people. And I think that's one of the really important things that sets New Zealand leadership apart on the international stage. And I think it's particularly pronounced inside Māori communities, where the way that we do relationships is fundamental to who we are and also fundamental to our professional longevity. If you don't treat relationships well, you will just get evicted from working inside the Māori community effectively. And that the way that we do relationships has a particular resonance in particular parts of the world that gives us a distinct advantage. It's no accident that Māori are prominent in lots of our state delegations to various Asian and Middle Eastern countries. It's the way we do relationships that gives not only Māori entities but New Zealand as a whole distinctive advantage.
Thank you. It's a nice reflection on style. The next question is, New Zealand has been acknowledged as having a clear science-led response to COVID-19. To what extent was or is the successful Māori response to COVID-19 underpinned by science?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, which has got broader elements of how much of attribution. So how much can we attribute this unique positive social outcome story to science, or to the really courageous decision to go into lockdown fast, or to the relative isolation of lots of our Māori communities, or possibly that in lots of Māori communities there will have been less international travel. And because of the fast response to the pandemic, we're never going to have sound evidence to really splice and dice how the attribution could and should lie. I think what we do know from existing patterns is that mainstream responses that don't have targeted Māori elements have consistently worsened the embedded inequality outcomes. So we would expect that without there being some targeted Māori element, that we would have an exact mirroring of Māori health outcomes into a COVID context. And science is embedded into hopefully all of our mainstream responses, but it does suggest that science and the lockdown decision themselves are not sufficient to have achieved that disproportionate outcome that we have. They're absolutely fundamental. If we hadn't gone into lockdown, if there hadn't been really good science informing how as a nation we managed it, then absolutely Māori would have not had the good outcomes that we've been fortunate to have. But equally, without the Māori response, we wouldn't have had, in my opinion, perhaps not all, but a really significant proportion of that positive social variance, I think, can and should be attributed to the Māori response.
As an extension of this point, Sacha, one of the points you make in the article is you acknowledge the macro level government response, but nevertheless go on to say that Māori mobilisation and self-responsibility were critical factors. And I'm interested in the follow-on point you make from that, which is around it being a demonstration of a strengths-based approach at scale that underscores a progressive transition to self-determination. Can you just expand on that a little for us?
So I think that the most important point is, what do we mean by self-determination? Because self-determination's being politicised as meaning political autonomy. And I think that can be an aspect of self-determination, and it can be a critical aspect of self-determination. But self-determination more broadly is about the ability to aspire to and realise a desired destiny. When we look at all of the international human rights instruments, self-determination is about the ability to control your own development in economic, social, cultural terms. So when we look at the Māori response as being part of that self-determination movement, it's in that broader sense of what is the progression towards Māori being able to design and achieve the destinies that we aspire to on our own terms and with our own resources. So that, and there have been, I think, a number of really powerful demonstrations of Māori doing that in the last 50 or so years, and before that, but they don't commonly get talked about and therefore recognised as being part of the regeneration of self-determination. So if we look back to the 80s, when our nans were leading the establishment of kohanga reo, that was a really powerful example of community rebuilding, and the te reo Māori outcomes are to be celebrated. But also sitting alongside that, the untold story is what happened when we got people at scale working towards a common agenda. So the relationships, the connectivity amongst the movers and shakers for the kohanga reo movement wasn't confined to just kohanga reo. Lots of those people were also prominent in leading other important transformational initiatives within our community. So you might organise for one purpose, but the legacy impact is the community infrastructure that enables mobilisation for other purposes. So the COVID response was powerful as an immediate response to COVID, but the way in which our communities organised will have a legacy impact of strengthening relationships, strengthening expectations that we can and we should do particular things. And I think more broadly, that's one of the underexplored elements of how we create social transformation, that we expect there to be a direct line between what we do and the social outcome. But for lots of the most powerful things, I think there is a byproduct relationship where what we do leads to an immediate direct level outcome if all goes well, but there is a longer, deeper outcome, which is the one that really matters. So for the Māori COVID response, distribution of food had an immediate positive impact of lessening hunger and financial insecurity in that context. The deeper, longer term impact is that the people who are engaged in that distribution network have a greater sense of their own capability to create other types of social transformation. And so I think quite often that the ultimate ends that we're aspiring to do not have a direct line between what we do and the outcome that we're seeking. And that's why seeing this inside a self-determination movement frame is helpful because it enables us to see the direct relationship is X to Y. The ultimate impact is a progression towards self-determination in a way that layers lots of different direct impacts to create a much bigger whole.
Thank you.
Thank you. And it's interesting, even in the way that you've reflected on the questions, your earlier point on relationships and the interrelationships between everyone that participated in this distribution network, and what we as society can learn from those types of relationship building. And the next question actually probably reflects that we've got quite a broad range of people listening in. It's, what advice would you give to non-Kiwis coming to New Zealand to take on senior leadership roles, including understanding the biculturalism context?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's, I think one of the national characteristics that we've got generally is that we listen a lot. And I think perhaps we listen as a nation more than lots of other countries. So I think the first thing for people coming into New Zealand is a deeper kind of listening than they may be accustomed to in a different cultural context. And recognizing that good and genuine intent can sometimes still lead to really unhelpful outcomes. And I think that's one thing that's really difficult for people coming into New Zealand or genuinely wanting to be allies to marginalised communities, is that good intent is a prerequisite, but it's not a guarantor of a good outcome, which I completely empathise on a human level, makes it hard and discomforting. And there's no easy solution to that other than, I think, a lot of listening and reflecting and thinking and reading. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question's on a more personal level, Sacha. It's, having experienced the recent COVID-19 crisis, what have you learned about yourself, and what advice would you give to leaders leading through a crisis?
I've possibly had an atypical lockdown experience. So I'm on sabbatical from my day job, and I was based in the UK. So I managed to slip back into the country 2 days before lockdown. And so the lockdown period for me was spent being grateful every day that I had managed to get back into New Zealand. And when I got to New Zealand Customs, I had a tangi, I had a cry, because I was just so grateful to not be stranded so far away. And so for me, the lesson is about gratitude. And I had already had the time in the UK where I had disconnected from the noise and decided about a whole bunch of different personal life patterns that I wanted to bring back to New Zealand when I got back into the noise. So those, and like lots of people, the things that really matter is the time with other people and the rituals we bring into our families and our homes and our communities. And that's what I wanted to bring back before the lockdown. And the lockdown made that more important. I'm going to learn how to say no really clearly. And gratitude.
Brilliant. I'm conscious of time, Nick, so I'll pass to you for our concluding questions before wrapping up.
Thanks, Renisa. Sacha, you do an awful lot of public speaking and you speak to a range of different audiences. Many people who are listening to this webinar today will be leaders in the business community. Are there any thoughts that you would like them to go away with based on our discussion today?
The one that I've been reflecting on is that my 2-year-old has recently become really opinionated about what should or should not be recycled. And the ability of a 2-year-old to be that opinionated about recycling, she is somewhat inclined to be bossy anyway, is a product of 50 years worth of work. And I think there are lessons about our expectations for timescales in that there was arguably 30 to 40 years in the recycling movement of really hard grind to normalise doing different things. And then maybe there was 5 to 10 years that was focused on really practical, how do we do recycling? And what does that mean about the types of bins that are in people's gates? Before, in the last 5 years, it becoming socially normalised, and to the social pariah status if you're not recycling properly, is powerfully guided by my 2-year-old. And I think that for people that are committed to doing change efforts, which arguably we all are now, as a result of COVID, we know that the world's not going back to how it was, but we've got to be ready for some really painful and boring grind to realise the change aspirations that we might have. And I don't think it's going to take as long as the recycling movement. I don't think we're going to spend the next 40 years trying to learn new habits as a nation, but we are going to have to do a period of grind. And on a really practical level, there'll be lots of people on this webinar that didn't have takeaway coffee for a month and thought, yes, I will maintain that habit. It is good for my wallet. It is good for my body. I'm not going to do takeaway coffee every day. And over the last week of being back at work, if we count up the number of takeaway coffees we've had, it's probably bad. And, that speaks to it takes real grind, real intentionality to create the new routines. And I think we have to be really conscious of that. If we aren't focusing on the little things that change our routines, we will slide back into lots of the pre-COVID realities that we don't want. And there's a lot on the line, because we know that disasters, if it's an earthquake or other natural disaster, we know that they've got a tendency to exacerbate pre-existing social issues. And there's no reason to think that COVID will be any different to them in outcome, although it might be in scale. So if we don't do things differently, all of the things that we were concerned about in New Zealand society, our growing financial inequality, the disproportionate disadvantage and where it's concentrated in different parts of the community, if we slide back into what we were doing in February, that will magnify in a way that potentially undoes our social contract as a nation. That's what's at risk. And there's, I think, a really emotionally unsatisfying response to that the best way we can stave off that risk and that future, dystopian future that we don't want, is by changing rituals and routines in our daily life. And I think, there's a big gap between these beautiful normative aspirations that we have for a better world and the really mundane, prosaic things that we have to do to realise it. So if we want the generation that's coming through to, like my 2-year-old, have normalised big, profound normative change, we have to be ready to grind it out and to do the boring and unsatisfying parts of changing habits to lead to a better world.
That's a great challenge to end on. Ngā mihi nui, Sacha. Thank you for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you indeed, Nick and Sacha. And it's a really fair challenge, and I'm guilty of the takeaway coffee, so challenge accepted. Our apologies we couldn't answer all of the questions that have come through. Thank you for your input. Sacha's article is due for publishing in August, and we will send a link out to you. In our closing, we would like to update you that we will continue to have our webinar series and to please keep an eye out for further information. Thank you to everyone who has suggested topics that they would like to see us cover. We have gathered their data and will develop a pipeline accordingly. We would also be grateful if you could please fill out a short survey for feedback on this webinar. We will send an email with the link. And really importantly, we want to thank our team behind the scenes who manage the technology and bring these webinars to life. Thank you so much, Amelia and Paul. Finally, we look forward to staying connected, online or in person when the time allows. Until then, stay safe. Kia kaha.